Okay, the Bible is a book produced by people whom God providentially prepared for the task. That's what it is. And they read books, they are informed by their environment, their culture, stuff they read, and God knows all of that's going on. He's preparing them from the time they're born up until the moment when he prompts them to produce something for posterity that becomes part of that thing we call the Bible.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells, where we exist to help you rediscover the Bible on its own terms. We found that the supernatural focus of the Bible has been suppressed, and we are bringing that back into the light. We're doing that with interviews and content from great scholars like N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, and featured here today, Dr. Michael Heiser. Heiser is one of my all-time favorites because of his willingness and bravery to step into fringe topics and give us a biblical witness and understanding so that we can have a response to these tough topics. Stay tuned for ways that you can get involved and help support this project. But for now, take a moment to subscribe so that you're aware of all the alerts that'll be coming up and releases about this documentary and other great content that we have coming your way. Let's get started.
My view of Nakash, again, is not that we shouldn't translate Nakash as serpent. That's evil. That's a sin. Mike says don't do that. Okay, that isn't the point. The point is that the term Nakash is actually a pretty layered term. It conveys more than one idea. Okay, profound statement number 4. Okay, any given word in any given language is capable of conveying more than one idea. Okay. Nakash is like any other one. As a noun, hanakash in Hebrew, can mean serpent. Just fine, works well, no problem. It could also be hanakash, just the consonants, could also be the one who dispenses divine knowledge, the one who practices divination, something like that. And certainly that happens in the story, doesn't it? Okay. If it's an adjective with a definite article, then you could translate it as the shining one. And luminescent vocabulary for divine beings is ubiquitous throughout the Bible. It is a stock vocabulary thing. So that wouldn't be unusual either, especially if you think Isaiah 14 is drawing on the same story of divine rebellion against the Most High God. Because there you get Hallel ben Shakar, the shining one, the son of the dawn. Over in Ezekiel 28, we have the mysterious figure who the Masoretic text refers to as the cherub. There is no Adam in the Masoretic text version, it's just the cherub. He is adorned with precious gems and jewels, and they shine. What an odd coincidence. My suggestion is that the ancient person would have read the passage and had all of these things floating around in their head. Because, again, they know the terminology, they know the language, they know the possibilities. They use all these terms in different ways. They're not reading it with only one thing in mind. And, let's be honest, besides that point, they know, Israelites are smart enough to know that snakes don't normally talk. Okay? And so this is a very common way in ancient Near Eastern literature. When you wanted to depict a divine being meeting a human being, having a conversation or whatever, it's very common to cast the divine being as an animal. Egypt does this a lot. Story of the shipwrecked sailor, again, the god is a giant snake there. I mean, this is common stuff. So if you're a literate Israelite, and you've read some other of your neighbors' literary stuff, these stories about their gods and their religion, this is going to be really normative to you. Oh, I know who. She's not really talking to a member of the animal kingdom. She's talking to a divine being disguised as one. I mean, it's just the simplest thing in the world to them. So why we as Christians, again, this is something I've had difficulty wrapping my own mind around. Why there's resistance to Mike saying things like this wasn't just an ordinary run-of-the-mill member of the animal kingdom. And maybe when we talk about Hanakash, we can talk about the alternatives. Why that all of a sudden is like, oh, that's just ridiculous. That's horrible. Oh, don't listen to this guy. Okay. Hey, the New Testament tells you who this was. Okay. It doesn't, it tells you that this is the Satan, this is the devil. I mean, it uses other terms, not just serpent or snake. So what's the problem?
Let's dive straight into your content, exploring your recent popular series on the Canaanite gods and the Legends of Baal. This series blew up for you, rightfully so. It was super enlightening and helped non-scholars like myself be able to read ancient Near Eastern literature of Israel's neighbors and get some great context out of it. Let's cut to a clip of this and we'll talk about it afterwards. This clip is going to give us some insights into the cultural context that the Baal myth brings.
If you go back and you look at the first rebellion, Genesis 3, again, the figure that will eventually become known as Satan. The word Satan in Hebrew is not in Genesis 3. The serpent is never actually called Satan in the Hebrew Bible, in the whole Old Testament. This is how it works in the Old Testament. The first rebel gets cast down to the Eretz. That's a Hebrew term for ground or land. It's also a term that can be used of the underworld. Why? Because in Israelite cosmology, the underworld was actually inside the earth. This is the realm that was associated with death. Why? Because you bury people when they die. And the being who's in charge of this, or who's the cause of all this, is this figure from Genesis 3 who has been cast down to this place. Instead of being like the Most High or above the stars of God, no, now you're going to be like beneath the feet of mortals, the ones that you sought to lead astray and destroy. So we get the kernel thoughts that actually are systematized in the New Testament.
I want us to look at the actual Baal legend, sometimes called the Baal cycle or the Baal myth. But this is a collection of literature found on tablets in the city of Ugarit, which is north of Israel, written in Ugaritic, which is very, very similar to Hebrew. And so by looking at the Ugaritic Baal myth, my hope is that you see all of the resonances that the Old Testament authors pick up on and use throughout the Hebrew Bible. Understanding the background into which a text is written helps us better interpret the text. And Israel didn't exist in a vacuum. They existed in and among the Canaanites. And the Canaanites had their own beliefs, their own practices, their own religions. I've put together a little who's who in the Baal myth. First, we have El, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. Now, for the Canaanites, El was the creator god. He's sometimes referred to as the bull, like his nickname. He's called the Lord of gods. But El lives in a tent on Mount Lalu. And Mount Lalu is believed to be the source of what's called the double river and the upsprings of the deep. And on this mountain of God, this mountain of El, he oversees an assembly, a moed, a gathering, an assembly, which is the same Hebrew word used for congregation of Israel, but he oversees an assembly of the gods. If you're a fan of the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, you would recognize this as a biblical concept, the divine council. Then we have Baal, or as it's spelled in COS, Balu. And Baal's title is the cloud rider. He is the storm god. He has another name, which is Hadad. And the word Baal just means like Lord or master. He's the storm god. He's the primary god. He's not the creator god, but he is the main one that's worshipped, kind of like Marduk was worshipped as the main god over in Babylon. Then the enemies of Baal and Anat. The first one we're going to meet is Yam, or sometimes spelled Yamu. And one of his titles is ruler Naharu. And Nahar is just the word for river. But Yam is a serpent god of the sea. He is like the chaos serpent, Leviathan or Lotan, Python in the Greek myths. He is the chaos dragon, and he's Baal's rival at the beginning of this story. The purpose of this is not to worship Baal. It's not to get people to think that the biblical authors copied scripture and made up stories and just adapted myths of Baal. It's none of that. This is just to show you these are the stories that Israel's neighbors were telling. And these are the stories against which God inspired scripture to be written to speak the truth.
Just want to say that was awesome. Can't recommend the series enough. I hope that whets your appetite, whoever's watching this, and you get over to Disciple Dojo, pause, go over there, subscribe, get on to this content because it's great. You did such a great job on this series. It's a helpful tool for us to see how the Bible's always in conversation with culture. Yeah. To that point, one feature I loved was learning about Yam, who is the Canaanite god's rival and also a serpent god of the sea. In context, the New Testament authors look back on the snake in the Garden of Eden and connect this figure with a divine rebel and even the Satan. But some scholars still try and explain the snake in the garden as something other than a divine rebel. How does this ancient Near Eastern context of learning about Yam help us properly interpret the snake in the Garden of Eden? What context can we draw out here?
Well, I want to be careful in the sense that anytime when it comes to Genesis and Revelation in particular, those two parts of the Bible, there's such ambiguity that it's possible that there can be multiple interpretations or even layers of interpretation at the same time. And so regardless of regardless of who somebody thinks objectively the serpent was it Satan? Was it a fallen angel? Was it a primordial enemy? Was it just literally a part of creation, just a snake that went rogue? There are all of these different views. I think the main thing to do is hear it through the ears of how Israel around Mount Sinai, as they're moving into the promised land and under Moses and thinking about all these things, having just come out of Egypt, hearing it how they would have heard it. And to me, it's a polemic. I mean, I agree with John Currid. He's written Against the Gods, and he talks about Genesis, a lot of all over Scripture. They use elements of ancient pagan concepts, but they use them for polemic purposes. They use them to actually go, yeah, you think you're worshiping the real thing, but you're not. Let me show you it's very much what it's exactly what Paul did in Acts 15 at Mars Hill, or Acts 17 at Mars Hill. And I think the Old Testament is full of that. So how does knowing about Baal versus Yam relate to thinking about the serpent in the garden? I think in a couple of ways. But before you even get to the serpent in the garden, you have an allusion to Yam in Genesis 1, when God speaks and the waters are separated. Well, that would have been a loud echo to people who knew the Babylonian myth, where Marduk literally splits Tiamat's body in half and uses it to create, but also where Baal conquers and then dismembers Yam. It's these echoes, but Genesis gives no notion of combat. Yahweh does not fight any battles. Yahweh does not have to use anything to create. He speaks it into existence, and he speaks and the waters obey him. This is what blew the disciples' minds when Jesus calmed the storm. How is this person speaking to the abyss, to the wave, the tehom in Hebrew, and it's obeying him? So there's that resonance already going on. Then in Genesis 3, when you hear now the serpent was more crafty, hearing serpent, and I believe the word is nachash, with the word for serpent, and there all of the resonances that are already carrying over from Genesis 1. I think Genesis 2 is recycling that content, that idea, to say now this primordial chaos entity is no threat whatsoever to Yahweh, but the same can't be said for us. And it is in opposition to humanity. Yeah. And that's what I think sets up the whole seed of the serpent, seed of the woman thing that's going to weave its way through the rest of Genesis and all the way to Revelation, which is why Revelation can then go back and say that ancient serpent, who is the devil, even if the author of Genesis, even if whether Moses compiled or whether he was pulling from another tradition, or however you view Genesis authorship, even if the Genesis author wasn't specifically thinking, I'm going to call Satan the serpent, there was still this awareness of a primordial enemy, a supernatural enemy, a spiritual beyond, but also interacting with this realm enemy. And then Revelation, like so much in the New Testament, I think it brings it into focus. So I'm very wary of reading the Old Testament first through the lens of New Testament. As an Old Testament guy, I think we have to start and read it through its own lens. And then when we get to the New Testament, then we go back and give it a second reading, and you start to connect those dots. I get a little wary when people don't do the first part and they just start and jump right back into. That's when you kind of get anachronistic. You kind of get the stories about this fall, Satan being a choir director, and all the stuff that Milton and Dante wrote about. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think
Yeah, it does.
the Yam myth definitely has echoes of the serpent, and I think it's intentional.
Yeah.
Not just to Yam. I think it's of a pan-Mediterranean or pan-Fertile Crescent view of the ancient combat myth, the chaos kampf, as they'd say, the combat struggle.
Yeah, when you have the serpent, when we hear snake, we just think snake. I remember I used to be thinking like, man, like what, it was just like that's literally just what I thought, and there's so much more context that gets immediately uploaded for an ancient reader of the text, that when they hear serpent and they hear crafty, a lot of these things are going to be uploaded, and that's why what you did in that series was so important, because it helps us be better tourists and upload those things into there. So you just mentioned Heiser in that clip, and the ancient Near Eastern comparison of the Bible's theme of a divine council. Have you ever read The Unseen Realm? And if you did, tell me what you think.
Yeah, I've read Unseen Realm, Angels and Demons. When a couple of years ago, when his work was becoming more popular, and people were asking me about it, and I'd never read any of his work. So I ordered all three of the books and I read through them all. I was familiar with some of the ideas, and I'd heard him before, or I think I had read him quoted before. He's part of the Faith Life Study Bible, and I had reviewed that, and so I had loose familiarity, but I wanted to read firsthand because, as you know, people seem to either really, really love his work or really not like his work.
Yeah.
And I was like, anytime there's somebody that's polarizing like that, I want to get in and see what's going on there. So I read, they're on the shelf behind me. I read all three of those books, and I came away. It was good. And I've talked with this when I had Carmen Imes, who you just had recently on your show.
Yep.
When I had her on the first interview we ever did here on Disciple Dojo, we talked about that. And because I never got to meet Dr. Heiser, she was friends with him, and she also studied under John Walton. And those are sort of the two poles of how you can interpret Old Testament, ancient Near East background. Yep. You can either kind of lean towards Walton or lean towards Heiser. And so in reading, and I find myself in the middle of them. I read Walton and I think, man, that's a great point. That's great. And then I'll read something he says and I'm like, ooh, no. And then I'll read Heiser, and it was the same thing in his footnotes, especially. I'd be reading, I'd go, I'm not convinced of that. But then I read other parts and I'd be like, yeah, that's a great point. So to me, that's healthy. That's kind of the way. It's very rare that you come across a scholar where you're like, everything you're saying, I agree with.
Yeah.
And when you do, that should be a little bit of a red flag. But I found myself appreciative of his work and him opening people's eyes to the importance of background context in the ancient world. Now, I think where I would maybe not follow him completely is he puts more emphasis on Second Temple background context in reading the Old Testament than I do. I would want to put more emphasis on first and second millennium background context, and only then look at Second Temple, particularly intertestamental traditions, and kind of weigh them. I think he gives a little more weight to those than I would, but at the same time, I think that's what we should be doing, is scouring the background sources and asking, how would it have landed with them before we then try to interpret, now what does this mean for us?
Yeah.
So I find myself being a fan. I wish I had gotten a chance to meet Dr. Heiser, because I'm sure we would have gotten along great. He seemed like just a great guy, and I love what he's done, his legacy for Bible nerds. like unashamedly, unapologetically Bible nerdy, like, yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to do deep dives. We're not going to do application lessons or, Instagrammable quotes for the day. Like, we're going deep. So buckle up. I love that. And if for no other reason, I think he made a tremendous contribution to the kingdom for that.
Yeah, I agree with you. He treated everybody like a scholar. He treated everybody like they had the ability to digest the text, male, female, intelligent, unintelligent, whatever. Everybody, he treated the same. And I think that's so important. I mean, he even, with the Second Temple intertestamental literature, we can just reference straight to Enoch because that's where he put a lot of his focus and time. And I'll say that, I have so many clips of him saying this is not inspired and this is not a part of the canon. Like he definitely was big on focusing on that. But much like these Canaanite legends and that we're learning from what you have and the context that it's bringing to the Old Testament, same thing with Enoch, and these were the first people responding to the Tanakh as it came out. And their interpretation included a much more supernatural focus. Even if it's not inspired, even if it's not canon, we can look at it and say, okay, we should be maybe, having this lens that we're seeing some things through, whether we carry specific facts over, maybe that's not it. But there's a lens that we should be seeing this through that the original audience, the original author saw. And I think you'd agree to that too.
Peter and Jude are drawing directly, actually, on ancient Jewish books like First Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Giants, all from the Second Temple period, and they're all part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Peter and Jude are reading Jewish books, essentially commentary on the Old Testament, on this episode of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and they bring some of that material into their own writings in the New Testament. That's where they get it. Newsflash. New Testament writers, biblical writers, read books. I mean, we have this weird mythical idea that the Bible guys, they never read anything. They just were kind of like making breakfast one day and then they got zapped and they went into a trance. And then they woke up and there's a scroll in front of them. And it's like, man, I can't wait to read that. I can't wait to read what I just wrote. I wasn't aware that I wrote it because my brain was disengaged. I was getting downloaded. Okay, the Bible, some of you will get this reference. The Bible is not a channeled book. It is not the book of Arantia. Okay, the Bible is a book produced by people whom God providentially prepared for the task. That's what it is. And they read books, they are informed by their environment, their culture, stuff they read, and God knows all of that's going on. He's preparing them from the time they're born up until the moment when he prompts them to produce something for posterity that becomes part of that thing we call the Bible. It's not just downloaded like their brains were not engaged. We really have a deeply flawed conception of inspiration if you think that the Bible is a channeled book. It makes you very vulnerable to criticism, and it makes the Bible vulnerable to criticism in all sorts of ways.
I hope you guys are enjoying this series. We have so much left to explore. I just wanted to take a quick second and ask you to subscribe. This channel is growing rapidly, and I am so grateful for the reach that God is giving it. But I pray that we can go even further with the message and the good news of what God has done for this world. So please like, please share, please subscribe. Help us get the good news out there.